Dr. Adam Weiss, and I'm going to discuss with you the elements of an effective lesson plan. So this would be beneficial for current teachers or prospective teachers, and especially for students in my classes, because these are my expectations for how to write a lesson plan. And what I'm going to talk about with you today are best practices on what would be a very elaborate, detailed, and comprehensive lesson plan. So let's go and get into depth for each step. Here is an overall outline of what we're going to discuss today. We're going to have 5 overall parts of our lesson plan. First will be our planning part. Second will be our building background and activating prior knowledge. The third part will be the new content lesson that you teach students. The fourth part will be how you close the lesson or your closing section. And then finally, the fifth part will be differentiation. So how do you meet the individual needs of each student? Let's begin with part A, planning. So when you're planning, before you actually start to begin to teach the new information to students, it's important that you identify for yourself and also for your administrator, and hopefully you'll also share this with your students, the content objective or the learning objective. So the content objective or the learning objective are the skills, the facts, the information, and the techniques or the abilities that you want students to acquire in order to understand the information. In Texas, we have state-mandated objectives. We call them the TEKS or the TEKS, depending on how you pronounce it. And a great resource to look for them is called leadforward.com. If you're not in Texas, then most likely if you're in the United States, your state has their own mandated content objectives for each grade level and content area. Or you might even be using the Common Core, which is for the entire nation, depending on if states adopted it or not. So regardless of what is your specific content objective, it's most likely going to be stated and written at a level that only educators can truly understand. I.e., in other words, it's probably not going to be an effective way to explicitly say the exact objective to your students in the same way that it was written down for educators. So in other words, you're going to need to restate your objective in a student-friendly way. So when you restate your objective in a student-friendly way, make sure that you rewrite it in words and using terms and in a straightforward manner that students can understand. Make sure your objective is specific, and also make sure that your objective is measurable. There is a way to determine whether or not students met that objective. Next, we're going to talk about language objectives. So language objectives are especially beneficial for English language learners in your class, but they're also beneficial for all students. So even if you're teaching math, science, social studies, students are going to have to be able to have strong language skills. They're going to have to be able to read problems. They're going to have to explain their thinking orally or in written form. And so you need to make sure students have and develop language skills, and you also need to explicitly reinforce those language skills in your lesson. So you are going to come up not only with a content objective, what specific information in the content area you're going to teach, but you're also going to come up with a language objective, what language skills you want students to practice during the lesson. So your language objective should include how students are going to use all 4 domains of language, how they're going to use listening, speaking, reading, and writing during the lesson. Another element that your language objective can discuss is the key academic vocabulary words students are going to practice during the lesson. Next, you're going to determine the level of rigor that you're going to teach your lesson. And primarily, this is for mostly you and your administrator. You're not going to actually share this level of rigor with your students. Students are just going to be engaging in the activities which incorporate that rigor. So let me go into it a little bit more detail. So you might have seen my earlier presentations or attended my classes where we discussed that there's normally two different classifications of rigor or difficulty level, or the level or intensity of thinking that a task requires. So normally we have Bloom's taxonomy or Webb's depth of knowledge. Both of them are very valuable. I'm going to use Bloom's taxonomy for this video. And so if you look at the bottom two levels of Bloom's taxonomy, those would be considered lower level or lower order thinking skills. So basically remembering facts and being able to understand concepts. So define it or explain it in other words. Those are very kind of basic skills. It mostly requires students to memorize and to repeat more or less what the teacher has said. They don't really have to think for themselves. However, the upper levels skills, such as level 3 and above, applying, analyzing, evaluating, and creating, those are all considered higher order or critical thinking skills. So ideally, you want to have in your lesson elements where students are applying their knowledge into new contexts. They're analyzing how the information relates to other information they've learned before, so comparing and contrasting information. They're evaluating the importance or the benefit of one piece of information over another, or picking one opinion over another and justifying their point of view. And finally, they could also be creating their own representation of the knowledge. If you're doing a first introductory preliminary lesson on a topic, you've just started introducing, let's say, multiplication, you might choose to begin at the lower levels of Bloom's taxonomy with remembering and understanding. However, eventually, later in the lesson, and especially in subsequent lessons, you really want to expand and encourage students to think critically. So you really need to kind of go up in your rigor and in your the difficulty level that you ask students to use in their lesson. This is related to rigor, but you need to plan out some higher order thinking questions. So regardless of what level of rigor that you end up choosing for your lesson, you still can plan out several different questions that really make students have extended thinking. So higher order questions in general are questions, not in general, but a definition of higher order thinking questions would be questions that students cannot really answer in one word. They have to fully justify their thinking using their own thoughts and their own original knowledge. Higher order thinking questions also involve higher order thinking skills, such as application, analysis, evaluation, and creation. And I wrote this, I don't know if you can really see this, but another thing to note, and this is not always true, but in general, higher order thinking questions either begin with the words how or why. And in general, higher order thinking questions do not just have one right answer. There might be several different right answers. It's more about how students explain and justify their thinking. Now we're going to get into part B of your lesson plan, building background and meaning. You will need to plan out a diagnostic assessment or pretest for students that you will administer to students before you actually get into teaching the new information. The diagnostic assessment assesses what students have learned from previous years or in previous lessons and what fundamental knowledge or background information they already have. Your diagnostic assessment should be something that you can do pretty quickly and something that you can get immediate data on individual students. So you want to provide data on individual students so that you know which students might need more support during the lesson, but also you'll need to know which specific concepts from the year before or from the earlier lessons that were fundamental to understanding this new concept that students still need additional practice. So if you are explaining maybe supply and demand in economics, then you might need to first of all make sure students understand what is economics, what is how do we determine consumers versus producers. And so you might need to make sure you have that fundamental knowledge taught to students before you get into a more complex new content topic of supply and demand. Next, after you find data on what students already know on the topic, you are going to explicitly write down how you're going to activate students' prior knowledge. So what kind of guided questions you're going to ask students to make them reflect and think back on what they've learned on these topics in earlier grades and earlier lessons, and maybe in their earlier home experiences or their own individual learning experiences, maybe books they've read or experiments they've done or opportunities they've had to see this material at the museum. You'll need to make sure how you explicitly connect and activate students' background knowledge, and you're also going to need to explain where this new information relates to earlier lessons you've taught. So why is this in the natural sequence? How does this current lesson relate to what you taught yesterday or last week? And why is it important? And we're going to talk about that more in a little bit. Next, you're going to have to explicitly build background. So in your lesson plan, you need to write down what key fundamental knowledge you're going to repeat or review with students that they should have learned in the year before or in an earlier lesson. So what is the necessary fundamental knowledge they'll need to know? So if you're teaching the water cycle in third grade, you might need to go back to the second grade objectives and make sure that students understand the different parts of the earth that are involved in the water cycle, like bodies of water, the sun, clouds. And so you also need to maybe review with students the impetus for the water cycle, like the solar energy from the sun that evaporates the water and gets the process going. Another thing is when you're building background and in your lesson plan, you also want to discuss how you're going to pre-teach new vocabulary terms to students. You want to make sure you pre-teach these new academic vocabulary terms because you don't want students to interrupt you in the middle of the lesson to say, hey, Dr. Weiss, what does that mean? That's a weird word. Or you also don't want students to do something even worse where they just zone you out or they get lost or confused because they don't recognize the words you're using in your lesson. So it's better that before you even get into the lesson, you pre-teach some of these key vocabulary words so that when students see it during the lesson, they're not confused. Also, another part of building background and activating prior knowledge is explaining relevance or the meaningfulness of the lesson. So it's very important that you explain to students why they should learn this new information. Why is it important to them? This will make them more likely to be engaged in the lesson, and will also be more likely for them to remember the lesson as well. So in your lesson plan, you should detail at least 2 different ways you're going to explain how the lesson connects to students' interests, how it connects to students' previous experiences, their home lives, or their home cultures, and also how the lesson could connect to students' career goals. Now we're going to get into part C, the new content lesson. So now you're starting to begin and plan out what are going to be the new pieces of information you teach to students they haven't seen before. So first of all, you need to begin your new content lesson with explicit instruction. Another term could be input or I do. So you want to start with primarily a teacher supported system, and then gradually, as you'll see, we're going to release that responsibility where we give more authority and thinking responsibility toward the students. So right now we're primarily teacher focused, and that the explicit instruction has the teacher detail what are the key facts, the key skills, the key techniques that students must acquire to understand this content knowledge. So you're going to actually detail them, and you're going to model for students, and ideally you might even do a think aloud where you're talking out loud to students about your thinking process in either doing an activity that uses the concept or how you're solving a problem. Next, you're going to need students to have opportunities to practice with the material. And first, you want to provide a lot of structured, supportive practice opportunities. So first, in the guided practice or modeling or we do stage, you want to make sure students have opportunities to practice the content with you, the teacher, and where you can provide immediate feedback and support if students need it. Furthermore, you also want to make sure you detail in your lesson plan what kind of opportunities students will have to collaborate with their partners to get additional modeling and support from their peers. So how will they work with partners or small groups to practice the activities? Guided practice should have both opportunities to practice with teachers, but also opportunities to practice with their peers. Next, you'll also want to gradually provide more responsibility toward the students. And so then you're going to have students practice on their own or independent practice, or you do. So you're going to detail in this section of your lesson plan what kind of opportunities you'll give to students to practice on their own the concepts. If something that you really need to remember, oh, that's my cat. There you go. I'm going to put you down for right now. One thing that's very important to remember is that your independent practice opportunities should be should be different than your guided practice. You should not have the exact same activities over and over. First of all, that's kind of boring. Second of all, if you think about it, we really don't know how students are going to be assessed in the future or how students are going to have to represent their knowledge. So we want to provide them with several different opportunities to use their information, or several different exposures to the information, or several different representations of how they could utilize that information so that they'll be prepared for their future lives and for whatever way they have to use that information when they grow up. Another thing is you want to make sure that you note how you will provide immediate feedback. And ideally, your feedback should be both oral feedback, where you tell students out loud, but it should also be written feedback. Maybe you jot down a note, or you circle an incorrect problem and you give some guided questions that students have to correct. But you need to provide some both oral feedback and written feedback. At the end of your lesson, you're going to provide a closing. In your closing, first you're going to provide a review of the key concepts. So in your lesson plan, you're going to write down how you're going to review with students in a new way. So what are going to be the key concepts or techniques that you're going to want to go over with students, how students are going to practice with the key vocabulary words and demonstrate to you that they're ready for the assessment. And moreover, you also want to provide students opportunities to self-assess their own progress in their learning, whether or not they understood the lesson, whether or not they feel they're ready for the assessment, whether or not they have other thoughts or other curiosities about the concepts that they might want to explore in other grades or in subsequent lessons. Furthermore, during this time period of self-assessment, you want to also encourage students to form learning goals. So in your lesson plan, you need to describe what will be your process to encourage students' self-assessment of their learning. Finally, you are going to administer an assessment. And in your lesson plan, you should include that assessment. You should include the types of questions you might ask. If you've gotten your assessment from somebody else, it's important to cite where you got that information. So especially if you're going to turn it in for a class, you want to provide either APA or MLA formatting where you cite who wrote that assessment or where you got it, and just to give credit to the person. If you created your own assessment, that's great. You can also note that. But it's very good to have your assessment already planned out and even placed within your lesson plan. This way you can easily refer to your lesson plan and give your assessment if you misplace it, or also your administrator will really appreciate that, and they'll know exactly what kind of concepts and skills and how you're going to determine whether or not students learn the material or not. So in your assessment section of your lesson plan, include the specific questions or activities that you're going to offer for students to gauge whether or not they understood the content objective, the important skills, techniques, and applications of the material, and also the language objective. This is important. When you create your assessment and you include it in your lesson plan, make sure it has these following elements of a good assessment. First of all, a strong assessment is authentic. It's something relatable and connected with the real world. So students will be able to connect what they've done in their assessment to what they might see in the real world or what they might see in future grades or in college. It also needs to be multimodal. It needs to have several different types of questions or activities so that all different types of learners have an equal opportunity to be successful. So you don't want to just have all multiple choice questions because that might just favor students with strong reading comprehension abilities. You also need to provide other types of questions like short answer or essay questions. You could provide group project-based elements of the assessment. You could have matching or fill in the blank questions. That way, various types of learners can demonstrate their knowledge and have an equal amount of likelihood of being successful on the assessment. Furthermore, your assessment should be objective and measurable. So it needs to be objective in the sense that whoever gives it to the students and whoever grades it can clearly have a criteria of how to determine whether or not students met the content objective and the language objective. Also, it needs to be measurable in the sense that you need to know who in particular of your students needs additional support and in what particular parts or elements of the topic do they need to review. Finally, we're going to discuss differentiation. And this is also very important to note in your lesson plan. You need to note how are you going to provide support for various types of learners. In your lesson plan, you're going to note and discuss how you're going to provide remediation. So in your remediation section of your lesson plan, and sometimes people call it the RTI or response to intervention section of instruction, you're going to make sure that you write down how are you going to teach the information in a new way for students who were not successful on the assessment. So first of all, you have to note how are you going to determine whether or not students were successful or not. So what was your criteria for putting someone into a remediation group? Did they not pass the assessment? Did they not reach 90 percentile? Did they not complete the activity, etc.? Moreover, you need to note in your remediation section how you're going to work with students in a more individual and hands-on way. So you're going to need to work with students either in small groups or individually to help maintain their engagement and also help provide them more individualized support. And you're also going to try to make the material more hands-on. So you're going to try to provide more hands-on activities. You might provide supplemental support like manipulatives or modified texts that are at their reading level. Or you might even provide additional demonstrations and peer support. However, whatever you choose, your remediation must teach the concept in a new way. You can't go back and redo the same activities you already taught them in the guided practice and the independent practice because students were not successful. You have to teach it in a totally different way, and ideally you want to meet students at their specific academic level and also based on their learning styles and preferences. Next, in your differentiation section of your lesson plan, you're going to note what kind of language supports you're going to provide for students, especially your English language learners. Sometimes we refer to them as English language learner scaffolds. And so you're going to note how you're going to work with students who need language support and how you're going to differentiate your instruction to better meet their needs. So some types of scaffolds you could be providing visuals or videos. You could be providing hands-on activities, anchor charts where you write down the information and the key steps in completing the problem. You could provide students with gestures or pantomime, repeated modeling, frequent pauses. You could write down and provide exemplars or examples of successful finished work. You could provide graphic organizers, and you could also offer supplemental materials like bilingual dictionaries, native language texts, or modified texts that are texts that are at students' reading level. Finally, and I've kind of already talked about this as well, as much as possible, you might also want to offer native language support in students' native language. So even if you don't speak that language, you might be able to find instructional videos in that language, or you might be able to find instructional texts, or even just fictional texts in that language, so students practice their reading skills. Or you could even find activities that students can work with their parents in their native language to participate and complete the activity. All of these are important English language learner scaffolds that you should note in your lesson plan. Finally, in your lesson plan, you need to discuss how you're going to provide enrichment. So for enrichment, you're going to think about how are you going to challenge and meet the needs of your advanced students. So these could be students who are gifted and talented, or it could just be students who did already pretty well on the assessment and need to be challenged and need to have their thinking expanded upon. So when you're thinking about your enrichment, you want to make sure of the following elements. You want to note and write down in your lesson plan your enrichment activity, and in your enrichment activity needs to have a higher level of rigor. It needs to be more challenging than the initial lesson. You want to really increase their critical thinking skills. Now, if you're at the top level of rigor, if students have already created a representation of their own knowledge of the topic, have them create a second representation that's totally different. But you still need to kind of expand on their level of rigor or challenge them. Moreover, a nice guideline for enrichment activities are that good enrichment activities are self-directed and self-explanatory, where students can work for the most part in small groups or with a partner and complete the activity on their own without having to come to the teacher repeatedly for support. Ideally, as a teacher, you want to spend your limited amount of, let's say, intervention time or small group time working with students who need remediation and language support. So those are the students that are struggling and are not being successful on their own, who need your support. For the most part, in enrichment groups, students who have done well on the assessment and who are gifted and talented are most likely going to be able to be successful on their own if they're given clear instructions and expectations. So when you give them an enrichment activity, of course you're going to give them those clear instructions, clear expectations, and maybe give them an example or a demonstration. But then you're going to kind of set them off and let them work on their own in small groups. And the best types of enrichment activities that I found are activities where students get to creatively apply their learning and create their own representation of their learning. So, for example, they're creating posters or a play or a short story or book about what they've learned. They're solving a real-world problem and researching on how to solve that problem. Or they're maybe writing their own instructional materials or practice problems to share with their peers. All of those are wonderful enrichment activities that not only challenge students, but have students work on with partners and collaboratively without having to interrupt the teacher while she or he is doing that small group support. So those are all the elements of a lesson plan that you should detail in a strong, comprehensive lesson plan. Thank you very much for your attention, and I appreciate it. Have a great day.